Confessions of a Spanish Teacher, Part 2. Then Elaine's dad appeared, and that was all difficult because her mum and dad were not speaking. They had not spoken for years since they had separated. There was so much bad blood between them. He had married again and had a young family. Her brother Stuart had also arrived, and he occupied himself with Elaine's father while I comforted her mother. Elaine went into surgery to relieve the pressure on her brain. I remember I stayed there quite a long time. We were in a waiting room with another family with a loved one in a similar condition after a motorcycle accident. We got to know that family so well. It was like being in a bubble where only they and us existed. We talked, we laughed, we cried for what seemed hours, but today I cannot remember anything about them. I only remember that at some point the surgeon came in to tell them that the operation on their son had been a success and that he would recover. They would soon be able to speak to him. Our feelings were a weird combination of joy and relief for them, combined with a tiny bit of jealousy or envy that their loved one had pulled through. Would we get the same result? Unfortunately, we would not be so lucky. From here, my recollection is a little bit hazy. I think that we were told that she was out of surgery, which had gone as well as can be expected. And Elaine was now on a life support machine. Only time would tell if her brain would recover from the terrible trauma it had received. We were advised to go home as there was nothing else we could do. Only family would be allowed in to see her. I simply don't remember if I got a taxi home or whether the police dropped me off. The next day was a normal working day. Sorry, just adjusting my halo. I'm going to wear my halo while I'm telling the story. The next day was a normal working day, and my parents told me to ring in sick as I'd not slept at all. However, the thought of just sitting at home thinking was unbearable, so off I went to work. I expect a lot of you listening to this have suffered a similar experience of worrying over a loved one and their well-being, and we all deal with it in different ways. I could not sit around. I was working at the Department of Health and Social Security at the time, and that day I was on reception. As you can imagine, we do get quite a lot of very difficult people coming through as well as genuine cases. I just felt like screaming. Don't you know what's happened to my friend? You wonder why the world doesn't stop turning, don't you? But it just carries on. Everything carries on as normal. Meanwhile, your life will never be the same again. Elaine was in intensive care on a life support machine for around 2 weeks. Finally, on Christmas Day, the decision was taken by the parents on the advice of the doctors to turn off her life support machine. Elaine had been declared brain dead. Also, the physical injuries to her body were catastrophic. Her pelvis was shattered and nearly every bone was broken. All Elaine ever wanted was to get married and have children. This was never to be for her. Her mother and father had to make the final awful decision to give permission to turn off the life support machine. That must have been heart-wrenching. You can imagine that from then on, Christmas Day was a terrible day for me. Bereavement's bad enough at any time of year, but when you lose someone at Christmas or any other significant day, it is even worse. Christmas is rammed down your throat. You can't escape it or pretend it's not happening. Everyone is celebrating and being with friends and family. Christmas can be excruciating for many people for many reasons. It was like this for me for many years. For a very, very long time, I never enjoyed Christmas again. I just couldn't look forward to it because I thought I wouldn't see it. Elaine had looked forward so much to that Christmas, and she did not live to see her Christmas party. An enduring memory I have is when the nurse gave us her possessions that awful night. One item was a brand new dress coat in a boutique bag that she had obviously bought that day for her party. Sorry. It was covered in yogurt that had burst out of a pot that must have been in the bag with it when she was dragged down the road. That sight is still with me, as vivid as ever. And even as I write this, tears are falling. I can't even say it. She would have been so happy earlier that day, buying her coat, counting the days until the party she would never attend. It simply spoiled Christmas, obviously, for many, many years for me. Christmas had always been a time that I really loved. I was young, but everyone else was enjoying themselves and thinking about Christmas plans, etc. As I said, it is always awful to lose a loved one, but even worse, having to look at everybody else apparently having a great time while your terrible anniversary is coming up. Everyone is always asking you, what are you doing, etc., and expecting you to join in the festivities. Eventually, as years passed, I started to think that at least she had had the pleasure of enjoying the build-up, if not actually the culmination. And I could not continue refusing to look forward to Christmas just because I thought I might die before it came. I felt guilty if I did enjoy it. It just didn't seem fair that Elaine could never enjoy it again. What right did I have to take pleasure in it? However, I did not really start to enjoy it again until my son arrived many years later. Children make Christmas, don't they? Elaine was a Catholic, so she was buried. Leading up to the funeral, I had so many nightmares about my best friend being eaten by worms. Attending her funeral was distressing, not only because of this, but because of the priest. Apparently, according to him, Elaine was in purgatory because the last rites were not given, and she would have to atone for her sins before passing on to heaven. I was outraged. Elaine was a gentle soul who had never done any harm to anyone. That awful man offered no words of comfort and just turned his back on Elaine's mother at the graveside. No embrace, no sympathy offered. This was the beginning of my antipathy towards the Catholic religion, and nothing I have seen or heard of since has changed this opinion. In fact, if anything, it's worse now. This was before the scandals of the child abuse, etc. To me, it's simply foul. Led by the Vatican, a place of such splendour and riches, while around the world Catholics starve and live in misery. If you are reading this and you're a Catholic, my anger is not directed at you. I respect everyone's beliefs. However, the institution of Catholicism I detest. and most religions, to be honest. Chapter 2, First Love. This horrible loss led to another very important event in my life. Life really is like ripples in a pond, isn't it? Each experience leads to the next, and when you look back, you can wonder if somehow it is all programmed to happen for whatever mystical reason. On the 3rd of January, following Elaine's death on Christmas Day, I was clearly still heartbroken for losing my best friend at such a young age. Another good friend of mine had had a terrible Christmas and New Year for a different reason, as she had split up from her long-term boyfriend. She was heartbroken as well. We decided to go out and cheer ourselves up. We met in town in Manchester Centre, and we went to a club called C'est La Vie, which was a discotheque in the middle of town. It was a weekday, a Wednesday, I believe. It was not a day that we would normally go out. We were both just so depressed that we decided to try and have some fun. It was freezing cold, if not yet snowing, though I know it was certainly snowing the next day because of something else that happened. Off we went to this discotheque, just the two of us. And when we first went in there, it was practically only the two of us in there. Then we saw a group of lads in the corner. There were different ethnicities in this group of boys, which now probably might not seem that strange, but it was quite strange then to see a group, so many different ethnicities together. I'm going back 40 years. Oh my God. It was maybe not unheard of, but it's certainly just not the norm. One boy caught my eye. He was tall, very handsome, dressed very nicely. He was Asian. I presume Chinese, but later it transpired he was from Hong Kong. Christine and I were literally sobbing into our drinks at the bar as Let's Stay Together by Tina Turner was playing. This had made Christine cry and in turn set me off. However, as we were the only girls in there, our mascara running and puffy eyes did not seem to put them off, and the boys were looking over at us. There were no other girls there to look at. The handsome boy was looking at me for ages, but not doing anything about it. I was smiling at him through my tears, like you do when you're trying to give someone silently a come on, wordlessly saying, yes, I do like you, please come over and talk to me. This went on for so long that in the end I thought I was mistaken, that he must be looking at the girl behind the bar behind me. Suddenly, one of his friends decided to make a move and approach me. The boy I liked moved like a shot and arrived first, stepped in front of him and garbled, "Wanna dance?" I think he had just decided it was now or never. If he didn't ask me to dance, this other boy was going to, and I might say yes. So when we started dancing, I could see why it had taken him so long to come over, because he was a terrible dancer. He was completely without rhythm, and he was trying to balance a drink in one hand and a cigarette in the other. Yes, in the days where you smoked on the dance floor. And somehow he was trying to look cool at the same time. So it was a relief when the music finished and he asked if I wanted a drink. I found out later he hated dancing. I don't believe that we ever danced together again. He told me his name was Damien, which of course was not his real name. His real name was Su Wing Chu. But they all took Western names to make life easier in the UK. He had taken his from the film, The Omen. I think this was an omen. We spent the evening together and we arranged to meet the next night outside the club. I can't remember why, because it was a Thursday. But the next day I must have been out drinking in the afternoon because I fell asleep on my sister's sofa. When I woke up, I was already late for our date and it would take me at least 30 minutes to get into town. I got ready quickly, but I so nearly did not go. It was freezing and there was snow on the ground. I arrived at our meeting point 2 hours late. I was convinced he wouldn't still be there. So again, no mobile phones then. He was there, frozen and chain smoking. He had waited all that time for me. How could I not love him then? This boy, man, turned out really to be the love of my life. There's nothing quite like first love, is there? We got married quite shortly afterwards, but it did not work out. The culture difference was difficult. We lived with my mum and dad, which was not ideal, and there were various other significant problems. One day before we got married, I was waiting for him to meet me at work, and he never turned up. I waited for hours, but I could not contact him as there were no mobile phones in those days. I went home to my sister's where I was living at the time. He reappeared the next day, but he would not tell me where he had been. It was years later, when his brother returned to Hong Kong, that he finally told me what had happened. I need to mention another couple of things first, which became clear with this explanation. One day in our early dating days, I was practically living in the flat that he shared with his brother. I was ill one day and I'd stayed home while he went to university. I was in bed and the door opened, and it was his cousin. I knew him only vaguely, and he seemed startled to see me there, and he left immediately without even saying anything. Another strange thing that happened at some point, I found a letter of my husband's that had come from Strangeways prison. Of course, it was all in Cantonese and I couldn't understand a bloody word of it. No Google Translate in those days. Not that I could have put it in Google Translate because it was in Chinese writing. He refused to discuss it with me. All this made me very insecure. When he finally told me the full story, it all made sense. His cousin had been a part of a triad gang in Manchester, Chinatown. Damien had never wanted to work in the Manchester town centre because you couldn't avoid getting involved in some way. I had known that one night, only about half an hour after we had been eating in a restaurant in the centre of Chinatown, a triad gang had come in and chopped up and killed members of a rival gang with hatchets as they were eating. Luckily, we'd just left half an hour earlier. Dangerous stuff. The day he had stood me up, his cousin had been arrested, and a message was given to Damien and his brother to bring a suitcase that was hidden under the bed I was sleeping in that day when his cousin came round, and to take it over to the other side of Manchester. Damien and his brother opened this suitcase and it contained drugs and a gun. They did not have a car. They had to take it on 2 buses over to the other side of Manchester and hand it over to a triad member. They were terrified they would be caught either by the police or by a rival gang. He did not want to tell me about it at the time, as this knowledge would have been dangerous for me. I don't want to go into the full details of that relationship and what finally ended it. That is maybe for another book. Basically, the only reason I really want to talk about this is it's part of the stepping stone of why I ended up leaving Manchester in the first place. I often think about him. and hoped that life was kind to him, especially after Hong Kong reverted to Chinese rule. I think that first love is unique when you're young and obsessed with each other and anything seems possible. Some people are lucky enough to stay with that person for the rest of their lives. Unfortunately for Damien and I, it was not to be. After our relationship faltered, I just could not stand living in Manchester anymore. After a very brief rebound relationship with someone from work, I was ready to live somewhere else. Chapter 3, Leaving Manchester. One thing that had happened while I was with this man, Damien, my husband, that helped to lead towards living in Reading was that I left the DHSS. I was so bored with that job. Also, when I met Damien, he was at university studying metallurgy. When we got married, he decided he wanted to work and earn money, and he went to work in a Chinese restaurant in Alderley Edge, not far from where we lived with my parents. Now, of course, he was working nights, but I was working days, weekdays. I was never getting a day off in the week, and he was never getting a day off at the weekend, which was when I was off work. Added to the fact that I was totally bored in that job anyway. The civil service may be a job with a lot of benefits, and I would probably be retired. I'm now on a pension, but I was so bored I just couldn't stand it any longer. So I went to work for Ladbrokes Racing in the betting shops because you could work weekends and get a day off in the week. It was only part-time as a cashier board marker the days before screens showed the results, so I could have more time with Damien. That's all I wanted then. Of course, as time went on, Damien and I separated, and there I was, still working at Ladbrokes. I had a brief relationship with someone else that didn't work out, as I mentioned earlier, and by then I had decided to train to be a manager. Okay, that's it for now. That's part 2. Remember to always live and love very carefully, very wisely. See you soon. And until then, may your God go with you. Thank you.